All right, so this paper is called Strategies of Transcendence, Schelling and the Pseudo-Dionysius on Divine Separation. My name is Lucas Carroll. Let's do this. All right. In a famous quote, Michel Foucault quipped that perhaps one day this century will be known as Delusian. Although its recipient graciously passed it off as a jest between friends, a kind of Nietzschean pun on the definition of the philosopher free spirit as untimely and so belonging to no century, Foucault's prediction has proven to be startlingly apt in application to this, the first fifth of the 21st century. And what is delusion? Certainly, what follows uniquely from the writings and lectures of the great thinker Gilles Deleuze. But more informatively, it is a certain guiding thread or problematic around which these lectures and writings are organized. From among the many, the tangle of themes, one protrudes with particular force: immanence. It is immanence that inspires Deleuze's transcendental empiricism, that feeds his ontological prioritization of difference in itself to all the forms of representation which institute hierarchy and measure into things. It is pure immanence, immanent to nothing, illusion of eminence, that serves to name being which is said only of becoming. It is through his unforgiving commitment to immanence that Deleuze holds Spinoza out as the prince, the very Christ of philosophers. The commitment to immanence. This is identical with the expulsion of all transcendence. Immanence is n-1, multiplicity without the first, the one. Immanence is this worldly, sniffing at any valorized ascetic ideal or depreciation of life, frustrating any mystical, metaphysical project wherewith another world is set up over and against this one. This is the sense in which conceptualizing and affirming immanence is the ostensive task of modern philosophy, to overturn Platonism. Immanence is not only a Deleuzian fad. The critique of transcendence is forcefully taken up throughout Martin Heidegger's career. In fact, this is a particularly stark way of rephrasing his well-known critique of metaphysics as ontotheology. The collapse of the ontological difference between being and entity entails that the unrestricted meaning of being be assigned to the characterization of some entity, which assignment entails that this entity be conceived as the highest and unqualifiedly first entity, thus ontically prior to all subsequents. This ontic priority is itself characterized in terms of grounding. The highest entity, as equal to being itself, is its own ground. All further entities, all subsequents, are unequal to their grounds qua unequal to being, and so stand in presence on account of their existential dependence on the by definition external and exterior first entity. Conclusion: metaphysics, as forgetfulness of the ontological difference, is by the same token compromised by theology. In being what it is, it essentially establishes the transcendent. The trend of modern thought, from Heidegger to Deleuze, comprises a critique of transcendence. Modern thought, the thought of our time, is best characterized by the expulsion of the transcendent. This makes the problematic of transcendence particularly pertinent. In fact, inasmuch as immanence has become a kind of mantra, a sort of ontological orthodoxy scaffolding the limits of thinking in our era, it is the properly philosophic task to commit oneself to an untimely meditation on the strategies of transcendence. In order that thinking avoids stagnation, it must continue to open up the cracks in established thought. Such a task can properly begin by freshly elaborating the ways in which transcendence can be ontologically constituted. We will consider two thinkers, the Pseudo-Dionysius and F.W.J. Schelling. See enormous footnote for why I picked those two thinkers. Elaborating the problematic of transcendence. An absolutely minimal criterion of transcendence with respect to something is real and numerical distinction. This is in basic antithesis to immanence, which implies real identity. Consider Parmenides, who denied the principle according to which reality could suffer diversification, or Spinoza, who denied that diverse reality implied any real distinction. Transcendence is a relative determination. It should thus be understood both from the side of that which is transcended and that which transcends. As with all relatives, the determination of transcendence stems from an absolute source. The absolute source of real diversity and numerical distinction will thus be the principle which establishes one term transcendent with respect to the other. This procedure is basic, even trivial or banal. Numerical distinction between diverse supposits is an empirical fact. The ontological problematic which pursues the absolute source of numerical diversity, the search for the principium individuationis, is subtle, but not without a host of potential solutions. The common resolution shared by these solutions consists in isolating constitutive principles which are implicitly, virtually, or potentially of themselves really diverse, on account of which, when having become an element in an ontological composition, said composite substances can be determined numerically and really distinct explicitly. The case is complicated, though, and the specific problem of divine separation is inaugurated, when we continue to specify the terms here considered transcended and transcending. For we wish to consider the divine as that which transcends, and the world, the cosmos, the created order as that which is transcended. This is unlike the numerical and prima facie real diversity between individuated empirical syntheses, this paper, this chair. Its absolute principle cannot be resolved into items which are primitively really and numerically distinct. Theocosmic separation departs from the familiar model of individuation on account of the singular role that the divine plays in the instauration of all that is really diverse. Consider, the divine being is the unconditioned ground of all entities, the ultima ratio of all realities, the demonstration of all things. Therefore, the first is a se. To co-subsist in real diversity with the source of all reality and subsistence implies a contradiction. As such, divine separation cannot be accounted for in the same manner as individuation. This follows inasmuch as there are no primitively really diverse elements into which divine separation can be reduced or analyzed. All entity relies upon the radical founding activity of the divine, including the entity proper to such hypothetical primitively diverse realities. But this implies that they are not really diverse after all, instead being merely modes of divine action itself, in communion with the divine essence in the same degree as an activity really communes with, being only formally distinguished from, the active subject. But given this situation, the question arises, what principle accounts for theocosmic separation? The very reality of entities consists in the origination and continuance of divine donation. Because ostensibly there is no independent ground of entities, it appears that perhaps there are no independent entities. Separation of lack and need, as Levinas says, is no separation at all. Perhaps, therefore, the beingness of created entity is itself reducible to a mode of divine donation, eliminating all entity really separate from the divine. Created entity entirely succumbs, being reduced to a mere mode of the active divine being itself. The question of divine separation, then, is equivalently the question of the ontological independence of entities. In order to establish the transcendence relation, it is sufficient to seek out an absolute principle, the function of which is to render divine and creaturely being really distinct. So let's start with the Pseudo-Dionysius. The Pseudo-Dionysius addresses this concern by making two distinctions. The first is between God and his donation, the second is between the divine donation and its recipient. These two distinctions should be familiar as mapping onto the standard articulations of the central Neoplatonic triad, the unparticipated distinguished from the participated, which is distinguished from the participant. Let's consider the first of these articulations. God is not his donations. As the source of the donations, he stands above them. Key to this notion is that the divine being is, primitively and immanently, the perfection in question, without having undergone participation. The divine exceeds the order of merely having after, instead subsisting as the perfection in question. Because God is the source of participated forms, he is not himself common to that which is made common by participation in the forms. But this distinction between God and his donations is not sufficient to establish transcendence or constitute a real diversity. For God in his essence is the good, which is defined as donative self-imparting and beneficent self-diffusion. Inasmuch as his donations are acts in any respect, and are united to his essence qua good, they properly proceed from and subsist in the divine goodness. This follows inasmuch as all acts as such are immanent to the actors acting, even if the effects are transient with respect to the acts and actor. God in his entity is certainly distinct from his donations, but this does not imply real distinction. The divine being might therefore merely be formally distinct from the participated formalities. Having a different formal ratio, at least one of the components, the divine donation, is really inseparable from the subject in which it inheres, God as acting subject. The donations are clearly distinct from the divine ratio. They distribute perfections within the many, whereas God is perfection entitatively in himself. But inasmuch as they are diffusions of the good, inseparable from the good, they cannot be really and numerically distinct from God's goodness. It is perhaps in light of this that the Pseudo-Dionysius concedes that God himself is the immanent being of all that is. Let's consider the second distinction, the distinction between donations and recipients. It is in the space between procession and reversion that there is a created order to be transcended. Theocosmic separation is measured by this duration spanning the gap from Genesis to Eschaton. In the beginning, God is immanent only to himself, and his formally distinct acts have produced no fruit. In the consummation, there is no longer alienation, to utilize an apt Marxian concept, of the divine craftsmanship, as all has been drawn back up to God and made a fitting mirrored image of God, united with him in the same degree as he is united with his acts. Thus, divine separation is truly and legitimately affected only in the middle period, when the world happens. The being of the world and its degree of independence from God, in this autumn of the cosmic year, is established solely through the principle that distinguishes between divine donation and its recipient. The absolute principle of this separation is what enacts and preserves the duration of the world as not God. This principle, in the beginning, was not, and in the end of all things will no longer be, but it is the principle that preserves the distinction between God and creature here and in the meantime. How is it that the recipients depart from the divine acts? Even if we grant God a formal distinction from his donations, we are still obliged to really distinguish the creature from these donations themselves, in a way that does not reduce them to merely being formally the activity of divinity itself. Without this, there is no world as not God. We can rephrase this distinction between donation and recipient. Wherein lies the distinction between participated and participant? What principle founds this distinction? We might productively draw from the Pseudo-Dionysius' hidden master, Proclus, in his Elements of Theology. He states of participation that, insofar then as it has an element of identity with the producer, the product remains in it. Insofar as it differs, it proceeds from it. But being like it, it is at once identical with that in some respect and different from it. Accordingly, it both remains and proceeds, the two relations are inseparable. At the same time, procession is that which distinguishes product from cause, and all things are bound together by likeness, as by unlikeness they are distinguished and severed. There must, according to Proclus, be both a formal identity between participant and participated, as well as a kind of difference or unlikeness by which they are distinguished as primary and secondary. Proclus elaborates this notion within his argument for Proposition 18. Although the very same characterization or formality is found in the participant and the participated, everything which by its existence bestows a character on others itself primitively possesses that character which it communicates to the recipients, they yet must differ as primitive, pratos, and derived, deuteros. For, if participation did not imply this distinction, then there would be no difference at all between participant and participated. But this distinction of primitive/derived must be founded upon its own distinct ontological principle. Proclus presents this in Proposition 24. He tells us that posteriority in the order of participation entails a lower grade of entity, huparxin. That which is prior in the order of participation, Proclus calls higher in reality, pro-huparchon. We might thus say that participation occurs on the basis of a distinction between formality and entity. It is the formality, eidos, that remains the same and founds the identity of the participant. It is the degree of subsistence or entity with respect to the formality itself that founds the distinction between participant and unparticipated. In both articulations, unparticipated/participated, participated/participant, separation was effected by distinguishing between the formality had and the condition of the entity that has or is it. The unparticipated simply is identical to the formality entitatively and thus fully. The participant is the formality entitatively to a necessarily diminished degree. The twofold distinction is thus resolvable into a single distinction between identity and limitation at the level of entity with respect to some formality. This is the newest phrasing of the question of divine separation. The question remains for the Pseudo-Dionysius, what is the ultimate source of entitative diminution or limitation by which the creature is ostensibly separated from the divine donation and therewith from the divine being? The answer is clear. Limitation and declension are a product of receptive capacity. This is one of the most enduring themes in the Pseudo-Dionysius' writings, the explanation occurring dozens of times in the Celestial Hierarchy and the Divine Names. That monster footnote is every single time that it appears in those works. But what is the source of receptive capacity itself, as that which limits and distinguishes from the divine donation? The Pseudo-Dionysius contradicts himself on this point. In some places, receptive capacity is offered as the source of metaphysical hierarchy, thus providing a limitation by intrinsic principle. At others, the metaphysical hierarchy itself precedes and conditions receptive capacity, thus providing a limitation by extrinsic ordering. Both of these explanations encounter problems, though. In the latter solution, a contradiction arises, for it is God himself, through his donations, that establishes the hierarchy of being as such. In other words, God is directly responsible for the donation of the receptive capacity that limits his donation. But this implies that donations which are only formally distinct from God are said to account for the limitation by which the recipients become really distinct. But this would seem to reduce limitation to a formally or modally distinct aspect of the divine donations, which themselves are not really distinct from God. limitation that occurs directly through the divine act does not provide a principle by which separation is established. Thus, the production of limitation by extrinsic ordering fails to account for transcendence. In the former solution, another contradiction arises. The hierarchy of being is itself accounted for by the limiting receptive capacity of that which receives the divine donations. Thus, limitation acts externally upon the neutral surface of divine donation, excising transcendent entities that escape the immediate or mediated donative activity of God. This solution notably allows the Pseudo-Dionysius to account for the existence of evil in light of divine providence. But this is only an acceptable solution inasmuch as there is posited a kind of primordial receptacle of divine action. Co-eternal and ontologically desolate, antediluvian floodland, receiving and limiting the nourishing waters of divine donation. Insubstantial prism that, like pure difference, accepts the ray of divine light and propagates its transmission only through lawless diffraction. This primeval chaos is that wherein the divine acts. A chora, like in Plato's Timaeus, that, being really distinct from God and outside of God's acts, as that by which they are frustrated, primordially houses the anarchic and rebellious forces of an eternally resistant matter. This pre-existent material will then serve as an intrinsic principle of limitation inasmuch as it disrupts the unifying power of the divine donations. But although this solution accounts for transcendence, locating a principium individuationis, it necessarily does so at the cost of God's aseity and omnipotence, inasmuch as the chora must be primordially groundless and irreducible in principle to divine donation. Let's talk about Schelling now. Schelling offers criticisms of both of these strategies. No hierarchical removement can, from even its infinitely distal locale, succeed in fully divorcing itself from divine providence. Similarly, and consistent with parallel ontological commitments outlined in the divine names, the alternative approach by intrinsic limitation is critiqued inasmuch as primitive duality of opposed principles comprises the system of the self-destruction and despair of reason. He elaborates a possible third strategy, relying upon a unique principle neither primitively external to and co-eternal with the divine essence, nor coordinated with the divine being through donative linkage. Schelling argues that the principle of creaturely separation must be innately immanent to and seated within the divine essence, Wesen, itself, but yet must be distinct from the divine being, existens, which is the agent of donation. Thus, Schelling, like the Pseudo-Dionysius, also conceives of theocosmic separation through the articulation of three terms: divine essence, divine existence, and the ground of existence. Key to this solution is the distinction between being insofar as it exists and being insofar as it is merely the ground of existence. It is worth noting that Schelling announces this distinction as that by which his thought most decisively turns away from Spinoza's path. For, whereas Spinoza considers substance as both the adequate ground of its necessary existence and identically that which exists in itself, Schelling insists on the distinction between the radical and existential, thus sundering even the indivisibility and unicity of God upon which Spinoza founds his metaphysical demonstrations. By contrast, Schelling has it that the concept of immanence is to be set aside completely, insofar as thereby a dead containment of things in God is supposed to be expressed. The divine essence indicates all-powerful and uncontestably first entity without whom nothing can be nor be conceived. The divine essence taken absolutely is divine existence, although like all existence, this is distinguished from its ground. According to the firstness of this essence, the divine existence from all eternity fully subjugates the ground. There is thus a single divine reality, a unified divine being, though even in the divine unity, the trace of otherness is not absent. Ground remains condition of existence, in God forever satisfied. Unity is implicitly or virtually accomplished from all eternity within the divine essence itself. Ground and existence in the divine being are not really distinct. If they were distinguished as thing and thing, then Schelling would reconstitute the dualism of principles which he repeatedly denounces. Thus, the distinction between ground and existence in the divine is less than a real distinction in order to consist inseparably within the divine unity, and yet is founded upon some entitative diversity. The divine thus comprises a formal distinction between ground and existence, formal rather than real on account of the exigencies of the divine essence. He says, this is the only correct dualism, namely that which at the same time permits a unity. This distinction in the divine essence is that by which genuine creation is possible. Schelling says that in order to be divided from God, they, creatures, must come in a ground different from God. Since, however, nothing indeed can be outside of God, this contradiction can only be resolved by things having their ground in that which in God himself is not he himself, that is, in that which is the ground of his existence. One can imagine the horror of the Pseudo-Dionysius, that the diffusion of the good in creation should only be considered possible if the unutterable simplicity of the one itself is sundered. From within the divine essence, separated from the divine being, the ground is the chora in which the divine being distributes donative acts. It is thus that through which things are separated from God. It is, so to speak, the carrier of beings. This ground, which distinguishes recipient from donation, is the incomprehensible base of reality in things. Without this preceding darkness, creatures have no reality, darkness is their necessary inheritance. Within creatures, and unlike God, no necessity of unity between the ground and existence holds sway. Ground can come apart from existence, implying a real plurality of principles, alternatively in cooperation and contest. It is this, the revolt within creaturely existence of the dark ground, that Schelling dubs the being of radical evil. The ground's usurpation is the principle of evil to the extent that it breaks with the genetic and eschatological ordering of divine providence, to the extent that it implies a complete falling away from absoluteness by means of a leap, of creaturely being from the essence of God, wherewith to resist and reject the divine donations. This theory is a notable advance upon the Pseudo-Dionysius. The ground, which is only formally distinct from existence in God, is provided with an immediate explanation for why it ceases to be merely formally distinct from the divine being as soon as it is separated from the power of God to effect unification equivalent to the innate unifying of the divine essence. Once imbued with the principle by which there is real diversity between divine being and created entity, Schelling assures us of an eschatological reunion wherein God's love abolishes evil and accomplishes, as an explicit unity in creation, the same level of unity as was implicitly and virtually possessed between the divine being and existential ground from all eternity and before all creation. God utilizes the ground in order to accomplish this self-revelation. The complete manifestation of God as love occurs in the eschatological reconquest of the condition by which he could reveal himself. But this movement from God's implicit and unaccomplished unity to the accomplished and real unity, the eschatological movement toward the consummation of all things, still requires an explanation for how it is that the ground comes to tear itself away from the implicit unity of the divine being in the first place. The eschaton is promised, but Genesis is not explained. Real diversity between the divine being and ground occurs only through the cessation of the unifying power of the divine essence to hold them in singularity. To set out a remove from the divine essence in order to explain the remove from the divine being is not very helpful. For how is it that the divine essence is evacuated, and thus the ground made an independent canvas for the divine donations? The divine essence is abandoned by the divine being through creation itself, which is a divine donation. But there is an additional question concerning the duration of the not being in the not God in the being of the world. Schelling does not explain why the creation is not immediately the creation of the consummated reunion, God's unmediated self-assertion as love. The metaphor of needing to prove love through the process of overcoming itself is unconvincing. We thus rediscover the same scenario considered in the Pseudo-Dionysius. From procession, which stems from an initial unity, to reversion, which collects and returns into an explicit unity, what is the principle by which the world happens in the middle, outside of God? What is it that has initially removed the ground from the latent power of the divine essence? And what is the source of the anarchic force that holds off the consummation of all things into the divine being in the final judgment? To claim that this is the ground itself is insufficient, for the ground itself is subjugated in God. It is not the sufficient reason for its own liberation from God. Furthermore, defining the ground by its initial subjugation casts doubt on any degree of ontological imperviousness whatsoever, begging the question why and how there is a duration of the world as not God on its account, why and how there is a continued resistance to the divine's infinite love. So I have a couple concluding remarks, because we've said a lot, we're running out of time. I'll leave off with a general reflection. By working through these strategies and discovering their strengths and shortcomings, we remain in constant dialogue with contemporary ontology, as outlined in my introduction. But we also highlight vital and thought-provoking figures from the forgotten past of our intellectual history. Carrying on this historical extraction and contemporary polemic, we might note this much for further consideration. In both thinkers, we discovered that something like the Timaeus' quora accomplished transcendence, but only inasmuch as it accounted for real distinction according to the model of a principium individuationis. Perhaps further speculation could 1. Relate Deleuze's ontology of immanence directly to Plato's quora as a necessary transcendentalizing principle, or could 2. Reconsider the model of real and numerical distinction employed here by creating an alternative account of individuation that does not rely upon really diverse constituents as a presupposition. That's what I have.